But to have that be a starting paradigm is unfair, I think. I think we need to see men's sexual nature as a capacity to deeply bless a woman's life,
Yeah.
as a way to deeply give, to give pleasure, to give nurturance to a woman. And not because he needs to be the provider because she's too weak. I think that's a paradigm when we put men up and women down that interferes with intimacy. And many of us do this in our marriage where the man's here and the woman's here. So I don't mean providing out of a place of lack or inequality, but the ability to bless.
Okay.
Right? Like men and women that are happily married function as forces for good in the world in masculine and feminine ways. But it's a way of really being able to bless and to be able to receive that goodness is good for both parties.
Yeah. Do you feel like receiving, a woman that's able to receive in a healthy way, does that connect her to her feminine self, being a woman that embraces
Absolutely.
herself? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a way of feeling like I am worthy of this. And the beauty of my femininity, my female body, that I'm worthy of being loved and blessed and given to. And when you'll receive deeply, people worry about being selfish or you're less likely to take when you receive deeply. You live with a greater sense of abundance. You're more in a position to really offer goodness, right? We need each other in that sense. Human beings are wired up to really be in connection. And so being able to be strong people, we're wired up to be in connection. We're also wired up to be true to ourselves. And so being the kind of people that can really give and receive deeply is a way of being both true to ourselves and true to one another.
Okay. And what does receiving look like to you? Can you give like a situation of a woman graciously receiving?
Well, there's the non-sexual and there's the sexual. Maybe I'll say in both ways.
Okay.
I mean, I think in the beginning of my marriage, one of the ways that I took safety, quote unquote, but not really safe, was to kind of take a position of entitlement. I'm entitled to being loved. And I never would say that because that would be so unfeminine. Okay? Yes. But I would carry an attitude of like, you're the man, you should accommodate me. If I feel insecure or anxious, then I should prevail because I'm the weaker one. But it's an entitled position, right? And when I sort of started to grow up and wake up to what I was doing, I think to receive is to say, like, this person chooses to love me day after day after day. He doesn't have to love me. I mean, he made a commitment at marriage, but it's not a prison cell. He's making a choice every day to love me, and I'm grateful for it. Not because I'm undeserving, but because I'm not entitled. Yeah. You see the difference? Yeah. And so when you can acknowledge with gratitude that someone loves you and chooses you, and it's because of their decency and their kindness, and not because you're unworthy that it's such an amazing thing, but because human beings don't have to love each other. Many people are in marriages where there's very little love. And so to be able to see that when the goodness that's around you, to take it for granted, to assume it should be given to you, is to snuff all the joy out of your life.
Yeah.
I've told this story a few times. I had a landlord when I was in grad school, when I was single, and I used to paint the interiors of houses to earn money for grad school. And so I painted the interior of her house. And so she talked to me a lot about her husband during that time. And she complained about him, and he's not this, and he's not that. And he seemed like a good guy to me, frankly, but I didn't know a lot. Well, not long after that, he was an architect. He was presenting. In the middle of his presentation, he collapsed on the floor and died. And because I'd become friends with her, I was then privy to the grieving that she went through. And she had so much grief about the fact she appreciated everything he'd offered her life that now she was glaringly aware of, now that it wasn't there. And she was grieving for how she had not thanked him or lived with more gratitude and let that gratitude bless their marriage. And so it was a way of getting from him without receiving. Many of us get and take without receiving.
Yeah.
And so she would say to me, I'd do anything to go back and to thank him. Because what happened is she didn't let there be any abundance between them. It was like taking hostages was the kind of marriage she was creating with him. And saying everything he gave was, she'd take it, but it was still too little, rather than appreciating what her life would be like if it weren't there. And that's one way we can increase our gratitude is, what would I lose if this person weren't here? He doesn't have to love me.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to give to me.
Yeah.
So he does give to me. And that doesn't preclude us from running our life or from dealing with the things that aren't happening in the marriage. In fact, I think the more we acknowledge the goodness that's there, the more able we are to deal with what we want to change and do better at. So I think that, there's a way of receiving what goodness is there in the form of where you are ungrateful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, sexually, I think you have to see yourself as deserving. I think you have to let go of the control. I think you have to tolerate letting someone really know you and experience you to really receive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you may also, in receiving, recognize you may be partnered with somebody who's not very generous. So some of us are partnered with a spouse that's very generous, but we don't want to acknowledge that to them. And we know that we are. Others of us, in some ways, would rather be in the kind of guilt, non-receiving, in some ways as a way of masking from ourselves that we are not partnered with someone who's generous.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so sometimes we are afraid to confront what our marriage is, whether it's good or not so good. But I think that many women have husbands who do want to give to them sexually, and there are many ways to receive through even a husband bringing his wife to orgasm, for example, takes time, takes investment on the husband's part, and it requires a willingness to receive. Right? And instead of disparaging yourself in this whole frame that I'm taking too long, well, the thing is, women's sexuality is different than men's sexuality. And it does take time for a woman to become aroused. And if you just won't receive that and you're going to disparage it, you're never going to have the kind of sexual experience that you're capable of, because you're making his reference point as the reference point rather than seeing yourself as a legitimate sexual partner, even if different.
Okay.
In fact, sexuality that works well in couples is more female-centric. And we come from a male-centric paradigm that culturally, and you have to work against that idea if you're really going to both have satisfying sex. It has to become more female-centric, and willingly and happily so. This is, if men like to give, let them really truly know who their wife is and know what her sexuality desires, not just what theirs desires. And let the woman be willing to make room for her sexuality rather than just accommodating her husband and then thinking she's the good one because she's putting up with him.
Yeah, that has a lot of thoughts going on in my head right now, like how, men want to provide, women are giver, so we have to teach her to be willing to receive, and how that receiving from him, I mean, I know in my particular relationship, for my husband, he's more concerned during intimacy that I am taken care of than even himself.
Yes.
I can only imagine how frustrating that would be for him if I wasn't willing to receive that.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of husbands I work with who really, really want for their spouse to have a positive experience, but she kind of won't have it. And so then there's, they can't give really because she won't receive.
So in order for, you mentioned in this other podcast that in order for women to be a whole self, they need to be integrated with their sexuality. What does that look like to a woman if she, struggles with being integrated with her sexuality? What does that even look like? How do you walk a woman through, how to discover that for herself?
Well, I think a sort of starting point is that many of us have grown up learning that sexuality is a threat to goodness, and particularly so for women, that it's a threat to femininity, sexual desire.
Mhm.
I mean, we take as a given that women are sexual in that men are interested in them sexually,
Mhm.
but somehow that sexual desire in a woman is a threat to her femininity or her goodness.
Mhm.
And so many women learn to kind of disown or be at least at arm's length with their sensual, erotic selves. And I think the reality is that if you had to say who is more sexual by nature between men and women, I would say it's actually women. Women are erotic, emotional, earthy creatures. We really are. I mean, that's our sort of most natural state, is to be deeply connected to the emotive, sensual, earthy part of ourselves. But I think because we're afraid of the power that's in it, and we want to keep ourselves non-threatening and likable, many of us, we think, being considered desirable or not a threat is our most important goal if we're going to be in a relationship with a man. Many of us learn that idea. So we disown our sexuality as a way to make ourselves desirable. And this is, in my way of thinking, I believe, God gave us our bodies as a gift, as a source of wisdom and joy. And so if we disconnect from this source of wisdom and strength, we really, we undermine our ability to really function as equals. We undermine our ability to access this source of joy and wisdom in our lives.
Yeah.
And our sexual nature is only a threat in two conditions, is if we use our sexuality to do ill in the world, okay, if we use it to exploit other people or do harm, or to be so self-focused somehow that you are damaging, okay, but we can even do that through sexual repression, not just sexual indulgence, okay, because you can do a lot of harm in a marriage by never dealing with your sexuality. The other way, the second thing I was going to say, is you can see it as harming your relationships if you believe a man has to feel like a man by you being weak. So many of us think, oh, a man has to feel strong, therefore I have to be weak. Or he needs to feel good about his sexuality, and my sexuality could be a threat. And real strength doesn't need weakness in other people. Only pseudo strength needs weakness in other people. Real strength begets strength in others because it can handle others being strong. And I'm not talking about bulldozers. I mean, like being at peace and at ease with yourself and being able to be a force for goodness in the world. You don't need somebody to just slide underneath you emotionally or sexually if you're really a strong man. If you're really a strong man, you can love a whole woman in all of her sexuality. And you can even let her sexuality eclipse yours without feeling threatened.
Yeah.
Because I think women's sexual capacity is greater than men's, in that women have a higher capacity for, meaning men can get aroused and orgasm much more quickly than women. And if you're having 10-minute sex, men look like they're the sexual champs, okay? But if you're doing it on a scale in which women's sexuality thrives, then women take longer to get aroused, and they're pickier about when they're going to be open sexually. So they're pickier about the context.
Yeah.
But once they decide it's a good context and they get aroused, which takes longer, then the depth of orgasm, the emotionality and I would say it surpasses. And then women are capable of being orgasmic multiple times. So they're working in a different trajectory and depth. But if you're focused on men's satisfaction, you don't see women's capacity.
Okay.
Right.
Well, and that was actually a question that came in from one of my ladies. She had heard that you said that women have the capability, let me make sure I word this correctly, the capability of having a deeper, greater capacity, like you said, for pleasure than men. And she wanted to know, is this because we have a deeper emotional element to intimacy that heightens our pleasure, or are you referring to physical capacity?
Mostly physical capacity, but also perhaps this emotive part of ourselves, that we can feel it deeply when we really allow it in ourselves. But we have the physical capability of deeper sexual physical response. But again, it's that different trajectory. And if you're focused on men, then you look like the broken one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you encourage or say to women who struggle to orgasm if that's not something that's been?
Yep. I would say when we think of it as a way of proving that we're not defective, you're going to have a very hard time orgasming.
Okay.
If you see it as a way of receiving
Mm-hmm.
and expanding your sense of self, and see it as a way of really giving to yourself and letting yourself actually be integrated with your body and belong to yourself more deeply, you're going to find more permission to experience it.
Okay.
But many of us are trying to orgasm as a way of like making our husband feel successful. It's not going to happen that way, because it's not about belonging to ourselves and really allowing ourselves to be at peace with and accepting of our body and our sexual capacity.
Okay. So do you think there's a connection between women that might struggle with this and their ability to be fully open, be fully...
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely a connection and a desire for control.
Okay. Okay. And it could be just at a total subconscious level, something they're not even really aware of.
Yes. And what I would also say is there's some women who are with a spouse that they feel judged by, criticized by, or they feel inferior to, even if the husband is not functioning in that way to pressure them down. But if you feel one down, you're going to feel slower about wanting to really, truly open yourself up to let your sexuality and your eroticism be seen and experienced if you don't feel like you're really a peer. So some of us are hiding it because we don't want the other one to experience it. It's also can be a way of withholding from the other person. Also, if you're afraid, if you do orgasm, now they feel like now you have no more excuses for having limited sexual contact. So there can be a lot of reasons why we'll underfunction in a way to keep control, but we rob ourselves of our strength.
Yeah, because we really are meant, I mean, God gave us the ability to, he gave us the gift of sex.
Absolutely.
He made us to have that, and it's not just to make babies.
Absolutely. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Like for, for men, the phallus is responsible for reproduction and waste elimination. Okay. But for women, the clitoris is only responsible for pleasure. Okay.
Yeah.
So if God didn't want you to have pleasure, we would not have a clitoris.
Exactly.
It's a very explicit. And some people think, oh, the clitoris is this little tiny, mini penis, but it's like really small and insignificant, just like women. Okay. But the clitoris is this vast neural network. It has more nerve endings than the penis does. The opening of the labia is the equivalent of the shaft of the penis. Okay, so that is to say, the way we were developed, you have just as much sexual capacity. Now, men's sexual capacity looks different, and it's easier to find and experience because their sexual organs are more overt and women's are more covert. But they are equal in capacity, if not women's superior.
Yeah. Okay. I like that link, how you said, and I want my clients to understand it could be at a subconscious level. We don't realize what we may be having hesitations about that are keeping us from having that full experience of intimacy.
Right. And we think of it often as a biological problem in those moments, but our psychology and the meaning that we bring to ourselves and our bodies and our sexuality deeply determine what we experience, even how touch is experienced, because we're processing it through a meaning frame. And if your mind is tracking, I don't feel safe to be sexual here, even if the thinking about it is wrong, if you don't feel like safe, or you've constructed a reality in which you can't or shouldn't be sexual, you're not going to be sexual. I mean, you're not, your body knows. The body knows.
Yeah. And I'm sure been made that way for the purpose of women not being taken advantage of, women being able to protect themselves in a mental state.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, and then I think we can get accustomed to where we're comfortable, even if we're miserable, and not push ourselves into our strength.
Yeah.
And my work is very much about helping women and men be truly strong people,
Mhm.
not the kind where you do dominance and submission in some form psychologically, but where you really are living into the strength that in part is accessed through real integration with your body and your values.